For some, the revolution of Cuba represents a symbol of anti-imperialism and resistance to the US. And for others, it represents a cautionary story about political repression and economic stagnation. Fact is that today, in 2026, 67 years after the revolution ended, Cuba is worse than ever. Some blame the Cuban government and others the US sanctions.
This video is not meant to take one side or another. We are simply going to look at the facts that led to the Cuban Revolution and to the longest trade embargo in modern history that lasts since more than 60 years. I think understanding the revolution and the facts around it is very important to make up your own opinion about the current political situation here in Cuba. And that is why we are going to visit key places of the Cuban Revolution. Here in Santiago de Cuba, a city that is known as the birthplace of the Cuban Revolution. It was here where it all started and here where the Cuban Revolution was finally announced a success. Santiago de Cuba is Cuba's second largest city. However, it feels more like a small town. And it is a very laid-back city. You know that they say that if you travel to Cuba, you will feel like you are traveling through time. And here it's definitely completely true. I think that's also due to the gasoline crisis. There is hardly any gasoline right now and people are simply saving and not driving their cars as often anymore. You will see a lot of horses on the streets, a lot of people being transported in carriages with horses. It is a beautiful city, honestly. There's lots of beautiful colonial architecture here and you really feel the weight of history in Santiago de Cuba. In 1952, Cuba was ruled by a dictator named Batista, and Batista didn't gain power because of elections. He came to power due to a military coup. During that time, Cubans were quite unhappy with their situation. There was lots of corruption, lots of poverty, and no free elections. And then in 1953, a young lawyer tried to overthrow Batista's government. This was Fidel Castro. At that time, he and others tried to attack a military base, which is exactly this building here behind me. These are known as the Moncada barracks. And until today you can still see some bullet holes there in the walls. However, this building has mostly been restored, but these holes in the wall behind me still remind of this attack. However, the attack failed and Fidel Castro was arrested. But nevertheless, that day of the attack, the 26th of July 1953, became a very important day because it marked the start of the Cuban Revolution. 2 years later, Fidel Castro got released from prison and he went to Mexico, which is where he also met Che Guevara. Together, the two men were building up a group of about 80 men and they returned here to Cuba. And they tried another attempt to overthrow the government. Again, the second attempt failed and most of the men were killed. Only about 20 of them, including Fidel and Che, survived the attack and they started to hide in the mountains not too far away here from Santiago de Cuba.
The time when Fidel and his small group of about 20 rebels hid in the mountains was key for the revolution and it shaped Fidel's image. When they moved into the mountains of the Sierra Maestra, the revolution was almost over before it had begun. The group was small, poorly equipped and constantly hunted by the army of Batista. Their first priority was simply to survive. They wanted to hide and avoid direct confrontation. The rebels slowly began to grow by building trust with the local population. Most people living in the mountains were poor farmers who had long felt ignored by the government. Castro made a deliberate effort to win their support. His fighters paid for food when they could, treated farmers respectfully and offered protection from army abuses. They also punished theft and enforced strict discipline among their own ranks. This helped create an image of the rebels as organized, fair and different from Batista's forces. As trust grew, farmers began providing food, information and eventually new recruits. Another important turning point was the role of the international media. In 1957, American journalist Herbert Matthews from the New York Times traveled to the Sierra Maestra to interview Castro. At that time, when the Batista government claimed the rebels had been defeated, the article showed the world that Castro was alive and leading an active movement. The rebels also launched Radio Rebelde, broadcasting their message across Cuba. This publicity increased their credibility, attracted new supporters, and weakened Batista's image, both at home and abroad. By 1957, only 2 years after Fidel's return to Cuba, the small band of survivors had grown into a disciplined guerrilla army controlling parts of eastern Cuba.
Fidel was gaining more and more power and the government was losing legitimacy. And with that, the rebels were able to move from the mountains into the major cities. They defeated Batista's troops, and a major turning point came in 1958 when Fidel's rebels entered major cities such as Santa Clara. With that, they divided the island of Cuba into two parts. They separated Batista's troops and were able to defeat the remaining troops as well. With that, Batista had lost so much power that on January 1st, 1959, he fled the country. And with that, the revolution succeeded. We are at Park Céspedes, and this here behind me is the City Hall of Santiago de Cuba. And on this balcony behind me, this is where Fidel Castro declared the revolution a success. It was exactly here where the success of the revolution was announced for the very first time. And it was a very symbolic moment. Fidel at that moment called for calm and for a tranquil transition. It was a symbol not only for a military change, but also for a political change in the country. And it was a very symbolic moment because here in Santiago, just a few years before, the revolution had begun with the attack of the Moncada barracks. And now here it was declared the success. But only shortly after the declaration of success, the US got involved into the situation of Cuba and also involved into shaping the situation Cuba is in until today.
With Fidel, things like education and health was free. But we've been told that it's never truly been free, because the government really paid miserable salaries until today. So even though people officially never paid for these things, they passively paid for it by having to accept a salary so low that it wasn't even enough to buy basic things.
After the revolution took power in 1959, the relations between the US and Cuba deteriorated quickly. The US didn't break ties immediately, but once Fidel Castro started to make drastic political changes, the relationships worsened. At first, Fidel Castro started to nationalize important companies. That included banks, the sugar industry, and oil refineries. These were companies that were owned by US companies. And because of that, the US started to cut off the sugar treaties with Cuba. The US was at that time the biggest sugar importer of Cuba, and it was a great part of the Cuban economy. Obviously, that worsened the economy here in Cuba a lot. And Fidel's response was to nationalize even more US companies.
With the nationalization of the companies, Fidel started something that continues until today. We've been told that basically all companies and businesses are owned by either the government or the military.
The conflict escalated quickly. At the same time, Cuba moved closer to the Soviet Union, and with that, it wasn't anymore just an economic topic for the US, it was also a security problem. Suddenly there was a Soviet ally only 90 miles away from Florida. The US discovered that the Soviet Union was installing nuclear weapons here in Cuba. These weapons were able to reach most parts of the US within minutes. That was obviously a huge security problem, and the US demanded the Soviet Union to remove them immediately. For 13 days, the world was on the brink of World War III. In the end, the Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles here from Cuba. But only if the US agreed not to invade Cuba and also to remove their own missiles from Turkey. And they did it silently. The conflict confirmed the US's fear of Cuba being an ally of the Soviet Union. It hardened the relationship between the two countries even more, and for decades. Even after the Cold War ended, the US never fully eliminated their embargo on Cuba. The US extremely criticized that Cuba was not a free country. There were no free elections and no free political opinions here. With what started as nationalizations, a Cold War crisis and the missile crisis later ended in the modern history's longest embargo. An embargo that lasts since over 60 years and impacts Cuba today more than ever. If you want to learn more about the Cuban situation, today in 2026, make sure to subscribe to the video because I will take you a little bit through the country and show you what it's like to live in Cuba today under the embargo of the US that is more strict than ever. Today, more than 60 years after this entire conflict has started, the US still wants to get rid of the Cuban government so badly. Under President Obama, the relationships seem to be improving a little bit, but now, today, they are worse than ever. Trump made sure that Cuba got completely cut off from any oil supplies. A few weeks ago, he entered Venezuela and took over the petroleum industry in Venezuela. And with that, he didn't allow Venezuela to send any more money or oil to Cuba, which was very bad for this country because 60% of the oil supplies for Cuba came from Venezuela. But Trump didn't end with that. He also made sure that no other country would be sending petroleum to Cuba anymore. He threatened other countries with tariffs if they do so. So today, Cuba basically is down to 0% of oil supplies. They don't get anything anymore. However, the US already said that they would lighten the restrictions a little bit and send a bit of oil to the island. However, it won't be sufficient to supply the entire population. The question is, why does the US do that? Cuba is completely crushed. The economy is completely down, the people are struggling so much. So why does the US keep imposing sanctions? Why do they continue with the embargo? Well, Donald Trump says that he wants to liberate Cuba. He wants to ensure that there are basic human rights here on the island, free elections, and a different political system. But then there are also voices that judge him a little bit for doing this. Since the island is already in such a bad situation, there's no sense to continue with these sanctions anymore. And they say that for Trump, it's more like a trophy to be the only president that has been able to take down a government that couldn't be taken down since more than 60 years. So some people say that he wants to do it so badly just to basically have that kind of trophy during his presidency. Whatever his real reasons are, we will never know, but one thing is for sure, the situation here in Cuba has to improve.
Sanctions are a problem, but it also cannot be denied that the problems of Cuba go way deeper than that. Cuba has never really been free. Fidel promised free elections, but they never came. Ever since 1959, Cuba lives with the same government. First Fidel, then his brother, and now Miguel Díaz-Canel, who was chosen by the Castros.
We are now visiting a cemetery, but this here is not any cemetery. It is, first of all, one that is extremely beautiful. There are very imposing and beautiful tombs here everywhere you go. But then there's also the tomb of Fidel Castro. Fidel died on November 25th in 2016. And with that, the era of Fidel Castro ended.
Some say Cuba got worse after Fidel's death. Others say that it has been worse since long before that and that the Castro family only keeps enriching itself until today.
Here in this cemetery you can also find other very important people of the history of Cuba, like Martí, for example. There's a huge tomb over there. We just saw the changing of the guards over there. So it is a very important cemetery in general, not only for the revolution, but for Cuba in general. Now, if you want to learn a bit more about life in Cuba and how the sanctions impact daily life of Cuban people, make sure to subscribe to the channel because in the upcoming videos I'm going to show you what it's like to be in Cuba in 2026, and I will talk to Cubans and I will have them open their doors for us to show us how they live.